what you want to do is you want to have the vehicle in neutral. And the reason for that is you want to go ahead and be able and rotate this drive shaft back and forth freely. The tail end of the drive shaft, we have a flange here that is held on by 4 14mm bolts and nuts. Let's go ahead and loosen those. Go ahead and rotate the drive shaft and we'll bring around the other two that we need to get to. We don't want to remove the bolts yet, so we're just gonna, if the nut comes off, just thread that back on a few threads. Now I went ahead and I took a wire brush and I cleaned a spot on the drive shaft, on the yoke, and the differential. I'm going to use a crayon, a yellow marker, because when I reinstall this, I want this to line up. I'm going to go ahead and remove some of these bolts. Before I remove them completely, we're going to use a jack to support the tail end of the drive shaft. We just don't want this popping off and come smashing down on the ground. We don't want to raise the vehicle, it is just there to support the drive shaft. Let's now go ahead and remove the other two bolts. Just as a safety precaution, I am going to use a bungee cord just to hold this up. We have the rear drive shaft supported by the bungee cord. We're now going to go ahead and take our jack. We're going to relocate it to the carrier bearing. We're just going to set this right here. When we remove these two 14mm bolts, we want to go ahead and lower this down onto the pole jack. We're going to go ahead and tap the rear drive shaft yoke. Go ahead and separate this from the differential. Just work it back gently, back and forth. All right, that is now loose. Now the whole drive shaft will have to get removed from the tail of the transmission. You want to have a catch can underneath in case the transmission should leak any fluid. At this point here, we do have the rear part of the drive shaft supported by the bungee cord. We're going to disconnect that bungee cord. This may be a two-person job for you. I'll go ahead and slide this jack out of the way a little bit. Go ahead and lower this down. And go ahead and work that drive shaft out of the transmission. Now, before we separate the U-joint from the yoke here, or the drive shaft from the yoke, we want to go ahead and clean this and mark it as well. So we're going to mark the drive shaft, mark the yoke. That way there, when we put this back together, they line up. We're going to use this press here to go ahead and push the cap in. We're going to remove the U-joint from the yoke. Now, when performing this job, replacing the carrier bearing, we do highly recommend that you replace the U-joint at this time. It's never recommended to reuse a U-joint. And on the side here, the cap has come out. I'm just going to grab a pair of pliers. Go ahead and remove that cap there. If you're going to reuse it, which we don't recommend, go ahead and set that aside. Watch for the needle bearings that those don't fall out. All right, go ahead and manipulate that drive shaft like so. Go ahead and set that aside. On the inside of this yoke, you're going to find a nut. Now this nut has a dimple in it. I'm going to go ahead and use a punch and try and open that up a little bit. All right, now let's go ahead and remove that nut. Now this nut here, we found that a 15/16 actually fit this nicely. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. We're also going to mark the drive shaft in line with the yoke as well. Let's go ahead and now remove this yoke from the bearing. Now that we have the bearing and everything off, let's go ahead and clean this up. Now our unit itself, our carrier bearing, has a marking F for forward. That is the front side of the drive shaft up that way there. So this needs to go on this way. We're going to apply some grease around the bearing. I'm going to go ahead and slide this in. Now on the inside is the bearing face. We're going to slide a pipe right into that. Just going to go ahead and clean our yoke. Get those splines nice and clean, free of any debris. And wipe everything down. Make sure that we don't lose our crayon mark here. Add some grease to these splines. Go ahead and line up the crayon marks here. Go ahead and tap the yoke on. We're now going to go ahead and install our washer and the nut itself. Let's go ahead and tighten that down. I'm going to go ahead and put a little dimple on the edge of the nut here, just using a small chisel here. Go ahead and use a pick, and we're going to clean out the little track where the U-joint clip goes. Do that on both sides. With this all cleaned out, I'm just going to put some grease on the inside of the yoke here, or the tabs. Going to remove our U-joint caps. Going to take one of the new caps. And line that up. So I'm going to go ahead, while applying the U-joint into this, I'm going to go ahead and use a hammer and gently tap this in. Once that's set, Now go ahead and flip this. You'll line up our U-joint cap on this side here. We're actually going to roll it to the side. I'm going to slide the U-joint over this way and tap this side here. Now the U-joint is in place. What we want to do is rotate the shaft. You want to use a tool to go ahead and fit the cap, but go inside of the yoke itself. And we're slowly going to tap the cap down inside. I'm going to periodically check to see if that lock tab fits in there. It doesn't quite lock in yet. Looks like that is about to fit in. So we're going to go ahead and use a pair of pliers. Get your lock ring lined up. Now you can see the lock ring has now expanded into the perimeter. Let's go ahead and repeat for the other side. All right, so we're going to go ahead and feed our drive shaft forward. Going to get the preliminary marking, yellow marking on the drive shaft lined up. Our bungee cord up here to support the shaft. Then just kind of hold that there. Now let's try and get the shaft into the transmission. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and raise the shaft and relocate our pole jack here. We're just going to get our bolts started here. Just to get them started to hold that bearing in place. I'll go ahead and do this on both sides. Now for the tail part of the drive shaft, we do have our markings. We can go ahead and rotate the shaft. Get that lined up. We did put some blue Loctite on our threads here. And we're just going to go ahead and get all of these bolts started and get the nuts threaded on as far as you can by hand. Once we have all four of the bolts put in and the nuts started, let's go ahead and snug them down. Now we can go ahead and snug down the carrier bolts. Let's go ahead and remove our jack. Once that's out of the way, let's go ahead and remove our bungee cord. Now we're going to go ahead and torque our carrier bearing bolts to 30 foot-pounds. We're going to put a pry bar behind the bolt on the other side and torque these to 65 foot-pounds. And repeat for the other three. When we pull the front drive shaft, a little bit of transmission fluid had come out. Not enough to make it a concern to us, but if you feel like you want to go ahead and check that fluid, go ahead and do so. Now's the time to do it.